With 2022 being the 70th anniversary of Scope, we thought we'd speak with Alex, who works for Scope, about the history of the charity. Afternoon, Alex.
Hello, Ross.
Firstly, to start us off, would you like to tell us a bit about your role at Scope and how you became to be so familiar with the organisation's history?
Yeah, sure. I joined Scope in 1994, and it was actually my first day was the day after the big relaunch. So we changed our name in 1994 from the Spastic Society to Scope. It was after 2 years of consultation with various stakeholders, and so it's been a very big event in the charity's sort of life. And so it was quite an interesting point to come into the organisation. So, people were really tired after a really big launch event down by the Thames, where they launched this huge flag with Scope written on it, which was put on the side of St Thomas's Hospital. And so it was an interesting time to walk into the charity.
Yeah, definitely seems like it was an interesting moment to join. I guess where better to start than right at the beginning. So 1952, Scope is founded. What is the story behind that?
Okay, well, the way it started was there were 3 fathers of children with cerebral palsy who attended a school called St Margaret's in Croydon. And it was a school for children with cerebral palsy at a time when a lot of disabled children were labelled as ineducable, and basically they were faced with the prospect of there was no secondary school for their children to go to, and so they decided that the only way they could think of to address this, because they had no rights to an education for their children, was to try and raise £1 million, which in the 1950s was a hell of a lot of money, to build a school. To build a school, and for their children that their children could go to. And they were joined. So that was Ian Dawson Shepherd, who was in advertising, Alex Moira, who was an architect, and Eric Hodgson, who was an accountant. And they were joined by a social worker called Jean Garwood, and they decided to form the charity, and they had the first annual general meeting on the 5th of January 1952, and they invited people from around the country who had children with cerebral palsy to join them. So at the first annual general meeting on the 5th of January 1952, there was probably only one disabled adult in the room, and that was Bill Hargreaves, who found out about the meeting and was very keen to go along, because although he supported the idea of a school for children with cerebral palsy, his first question was, what happens after they finish education? How are they going to find jobs? So that was where the sort of second strand of Scope's work began.
Yeah, and Bill Hargreaves, the name you mentioned there, it's moving on 5 years later to about 1957, when he became the first employment officer of the organisation.
Yeah, so as I say, Bill Hargreaves was at the very first annual general meeting, and I think they realised that his voice was one that they needed. So he began as a trustee, and he became more and more involved in the work of the charity. And when the charity decided that it wanted to create an employment service for people with cerebral palsy looking for jobs, they asked him whether he would be the first employment officer. So he did. He gave up his job. In fact, his employer, which is the Steelworks, they sort of let him out on a sort of sabbatical for a year, but he actually never returned, because he got involved in trying to find disabled people their first ever jobs. And in the years that he was the employment officer, he managed to place about 1,500 disabled people into their first ever jobs, often going into factories and other workplaces and persuading sometimes quite reluctant employers to take people on, but gradually he began to win people around. And he talks about how when he was going around the country doing talks about employment for disabled people, that the Ministry of Labour asked if they could have a copy of his speech, because he'd said, the words he used himself was that he'd become a sort of walking, talking tape recorder. And so it was just a way for him to stop going around the country in a sort of very small, what they would call the little blue invalid cars, as they were then called, going around the country. So it was a very tiring job, but it was an amazing achievement. And we still have employment officers today.
As you say, 1,500 people. Sort of, again, for the time, that's sort of an enormous achievement. Looking back at it now.